mass movement of men and material. A total of 136,000 railway wagons were deployed in support of this huge relocation. Amazingly, the scale of the operation was kept secret from the Japanese. Much of the movement of military traffic took place at night. Both men and hardware were disguised, and their final destinations were often well away from the vision of Japanese border patrols. The way that these resources were deployed also revealed the confident ambition of the Soviet military. With so much experience of war from the fight with Germany, Soviet strategists were able to allocate their forces according to their own experience. The elite 6th Guard Tanks Army had proved itself in the mountainous Carpathian region of the Balkans. In the conflict to come, this army would fight in the similar conditions of the Manchurian Grand Hingan Mountains. This was just one example of tailoring resources to the specific requirements of the task in hand, and it would be a huge task. To carry it out, Stalin appointed some of the Soviet Union's most battle-hardened commanders. On the 30th of July, 1945, with the relocation of resources almost complete, a new Far East Command was established to oversee the Manchurian offensive. In overall charge, Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky. Vasilevsky was a 50-year-old officer who had proved himself in the bloodiest of all battles that took place on the Eastern Front. Having risen through the ranks to become Chief of the Soviet General Staff in 1942, it was Vasilevsky who had masterminded the Soviet offensive at the Battle of Stalingrad, an offensive that contributed so much to the catastrophic German defeat. An idea of the regard with which he was held by Stalin can be gained from events that took place in February 1945. When Stalin attended the so-called Big Three conference at Yalta in the Russian Crimea, it was Alexander Vasilevsky who took charge in Moscow. In August 1945, he would be given another massive responsibility. Under the leadership structure established for the campaign, Vasilevsky was given a high degree of autonomy over operational matters, and the Marshal was able to allocate his land, sea, and air forces without undue interference from Moscow. To assist him in his task were three more veteran Soviet commanders with responsibility for the vast army groups or fronts that would execute the Manchurian invasion. In command of the Trans-Baikal Front was Marshal Rodion Malinovsky, another veteran of the epic Battle of Stalingrad. In 1944, he took charge of the Second Ukrainian Front that carried out the invasion of Romania, and in April 1945, it was men under his command who secured the conquest of Slovakia. The commanders of the other two fronts possessed a similar level of battle experience. General Maxim Purkayev, in charge of the Second Far Eastern Front, and Marshal Kirill Meretskov, in command of the First Far Eastern Front. Although Meretskov did not enjoy the excellent relationship with Stalin possessed by his superior Vasilevsky, he was still a vastly experienced officer who had made a name for himself during the unfortunate Russo-Finnish War in the winter of 1939-40. Despite having been overlooked in favor of other commanders in the course of the war, most notably the legendary Georgy Zhukov, by early August 1945, Kirill Meretskov found himself at the heart of the action, in charge of an enormous body of men and material on the borders of Manchuria. But he knew that he needed the resources. Within Manchuria, the million-strong Kwantung army awaited under the leadership of Yamada Otozo. In essence, the Soviet strategy for the Manchuria campaign can be readily understood. It was a vast pincer movement involving whole armies of troops and material. From the west, the First Trans-Baikal Front would sweep into Manchurian territory, across the desert, over the mountains, and down into the strategical Vital Valley plains in the region around Mukden. To assist their advance, Marshal Vasilevsky arranged for a diversionary attack by 36th Army in the far northwest. This was where Japanese planners expected any invasion to come from, and their regional defenses were accordingly strong. When battle was eventually joined, the 35th Army would be involved in some of the fiercest fighting of the campaign as they pursued their objective of cutting off Japanese troops in northern Manchuria, a task that also involved the men of the 2nd Far Eastern Front, attacking from the northeast. But the real Soviet firepower was concentrated further south. As the main body of the Trans-Baikal Front headed for the Central Plains from the Grand Hingyan Mountains, so the 1st Far Eastern Front would complete the pincer movement from the opposite side, with the 25th Combined Army heading southwest towards Korea, and the remaining 4 armies attacking west from a narrow area of front in the region of Lake Hanka. Their initial objectives, the Japanese military headquarters of Mutanchiang and Yenho. This was a simple strategy, and it had a good chance of proving effective. But the Soviet commanders knew that the Japanese occupying army were only too aware of the possibility of a Soviet attack, and would have made plans accordingly. It is not surprising that in 1945 the Japanese leadership in Manchuria were thinking only in terms of a defensive response, if and when a Soviet attack came. As late as September 1944, Japanese strategy was still informed by a commitment to offensive warfare. But as the tide of the Pacific War turned, a more pragmatic approach was adopted. By June 1945, the Japanese had established their own Manchurian strategy along these lines. Their intention was to engage the Soviet forces immediately, before withdrawing into the Valley Plains region in the south, whilst continuing to harry the enemy at every opportunity. It was hoped that these delaying tactics would combine with the difficulties of Manchurian geography to reduce the effectiveness of the Soviet force. By the time battle was joined on the plains, the Japanese would be in a position to take the fight back to the invaders. It was a realistic strategy, and the Japanese Kwantung Army was theoretically large enough to carry it out. But what they didn't know was the sheer size of the Soviet force that would sweep over the Manchurian border towards their positions. By early August 1945, the Soviet invasion force had moved into position, ready for the coming assault. To the west, the Trans-Baikal Front under the command of Malinovsky. His responsibility, some 2,300 kilometers of front line. To the north, the 36th Combined Arms Army. Further south, 4 more armies, including the elite 6th Tank Guards. Furthest south of all, a combined Soviet-Mongolian cavalry mechanized group. With air support and reserves, Malinovsky was in charge of some 654,000 men. On the opposite side of the theatre of operations, Marshal Meretskov took command of the 1st Far Eastern Front, a force that comprised a further 4 combined arms armies. With reserves, air support, and attached independent units, a total of 587,000 men were positioned across a front 700 kilometers in length. The Soviet deployment was completed by the 2nd Far Eastern Front in the north, consisting of a further 3 armies, again backed up by independent units and air support. Commanded by General Maxim Perkayev, the 2nd Far Eastern Front added a further 337,000 men under arms. In all, the Soviet Far East Command was responsible for a total of 1,600,000 troops, equipped with a massive quantity of material. This included some of the best-known weapons of the whole Second World War. In virtually every theatre of operations, the tank proved itself to be an indispensable element of ground warfare. On the Eastern Front, the power of the tank was seen especially at the Battle of Kursk, when it was Soviet armour that eventually prevailed. When the time came to prepare for the Manchuria offensive, the Soviets understandably kept faith with the tank as an offensive weapon. No fewer than 5,500 machines were available to Vasilievsky's attack force, an armour provision dominated by the most famous model of all, the T-34. This was the weapon that had stunned the Germans in 1941, and by 1945, the 5-man T-34 was still an awesome weapon of war. 5.92 metres long and 3 metres wide, the T-34 was powered by a 500 horsepower diesel engine, generating a top speed of some 55 kilometres an hour. Its sloping armour was only 45 millimetres thick, but in the early days of the Eastern Front, the German panzers found that their shells simply bounced off it. In those early days of operational service, the T-34 was armed with a 76.2mm high-velocity gun with 3 7.62mm machine guns in support. But by the time of the Manchuria offensive, the main production model was fitted with an impressive 85mm main weapon. In August 1945, it would be the turn of the Japanese to feel the force of the T-34. But this was not the only famous machine that the Soviet Union would bring to bear in the Manchuria campaign. In 1941, the Germans had also been surprised by the Soviet deployment of the M13 rocket launcher, the so-called Katyusha. When hostilities broke out on the Eastern Front, this truck-mounted weapon soon revealed its revolutionary ability to deliver awesome firepower against a small target position. No fewer than 36 rockets could be fired from the M13. Initially, these were 82mm solid fuel weapons with 6.5 pounds of explosive. Range was approximately 6,000 yards with the earlier models, and this was more than enough to terrify German troops. The M13 became known as Stalin's organ because of the eerie whining noise that the rocket made in flight. And by the time of the Manchuria campaign, an already fearsome weapon had become even more powerful. By 1945, the M13 was fitted with just 16 rocket launchers, but each of these could fire a 132mm shell with a warhead of 40 pounds weight. Range was increased to over 9,000 yards, and the Soviet commanders knew that they had a devastating war machine at their disposal. They also had a huge number of them. Trans-Baikal Front alone possessed 583 of these magnificent weapons. In total, the Soviet arsenal was awesome. The rocket launchers formed a part of a guns and mortars provision totaling 28,000. Well over 5,000 tanks were brought to the Manchurian border, and the Soviets were also well supplied with air power. In the weeks prior to the beginning of the offensive, no fewer than 96 airfields were constructed around the theatre of operations, and Marshal Vasilievsky was able to call on 4,370 warplanes. Amongst them, another famous Second World War machine, the Ilyushin IL-4, a long-range bomber equally at home in roles as diverse as torpedo bombing, infantry transport, or tactical ground support. The deployment of this proven warplane can be seen as indicative of the overall strength of the hardware available to the invading force that prepared itself for battle in August 1945. Powered by twin 1,100 horsepower engines, this 4-man aircraft could carry a bomb load of 1,000 kilograms, or alternatively 3 500-kilogram torpedoes. It was the ideal aircraft to be used when the Soviet Union decided to give the people of Berlin their first taste of bombing from the east in 1941. And by 1945, the IL-4 would find itself used in support of the invasion on the ground. This was an important element in Soviet military thinking in the period leading up to the Manchuria campaign. Over the course of the Second World War, the Soviet Union had adopted a distinctive approach to the business of offensive warfare. In 1944, the Red Army published a